You're listening to On Shifting Ground from Commonwealth Club World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. On February 24th, 2022, 200,000 Russian troops invaded the sovereign nation of Ukraine. And after a barrage of missiles began dropping on Kyiv, it was speculated the Ukrainian capital would fall in a matter of days. Some even predicted this Russian aggression was the opening battle of World War III. 2 years later, Ukraine fights on, but the world has shifted its focus to the escalating conflict in the Middle East, and international support for Ukraine is becoming more precarious. As of this recording, U.S. assistance for Ukraine's military is still being held up in the Congress. Any delay has serious consequences for the beleaguered Ukrainian military. And for our first guest, Michael Boserkiw, the aid gridlock in Washington does more than that. It threatens the security of Europe. Michael and I recorded the day a Ukrainian aid bill passed the Senate and was on its way back to the House of Representatives. Michael Boserkiw is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. He's an author, a former journalist, a global affairs analyst with long experience in humanitarian work, and important to this conversation, he's speaking to us from Odessa on the Black Sea in Ukraine. Welcome to On Shifting Ground, Michael.
Thank you for having me.
As we speak, the future of American aid to Ukraine is still, even with the package cobbled together by Democrats and Republicans in the Senate, still very much up in the air. Do you have any sense of how closely rank-and-file Ukrainians follow the arcane ins and outs of the aid debate in the United States, which, after all, also pulls in the southern border, Israel, domestic politics? Does this make any sense to Ukrainians?
Probably not. I think everyone at this point is looking at the big picture of what's happening. But I can tell you one thing, Ray, is that if this mega bill does not pass, $60 billion or so, to Ukraine, almost immediately, and this is a very scary thing to say, but almost immediately, payments to teachers, in other words, their salaries, and pension payments could stop almost immediately. In fact, I'm surprised they haven't already. That's how strained right now the Ukrainian government is in terms of its budget. There's currently a $5 billion a month budget gap that the Ukrainian government simply cannot fill because most tax and other revenue is going to the Ukrainian military. So a lot of concern there. I think what does cause a lot of confusion is when you have a former president and a Republican presidential candidate who's leading say things that, if NATO countries who don't pay up, well, Russia is welcome to go attack them. Well, that doesn't go over very well here in Ukraine. And I can tell you, Ray, that just today, in fact, moments after the bill passed the Senate, thank goodness, rockets started flying in our direction here in Odessa. The alarms went off. People scattered. Kids stopped their education. They ran for bomb shelters. And that's become a reality of daily life. And I tweeted right away, I said, if this type of funding doesn't come through, a big part of that $60 billion or so will go towards defending Ukraine, will go towards building up its defenses so that it can stop these rockets, these drones from destroying cities like Kharkiv, parts of Kyiv, parts of the port here in Odessa, which, by the way, are a crucial part of global food supply chain. That money doesn't come through. Well, the future looks very, very bleak indeed, not only for Ukrainians, for their neighbors, and Americans should see it that way too.
Well, here in the United States, there's just recently been a lot of reporting about war weariness among the Ukrainian people, that there are cracks starting to show in that unified resistance that the country had shown to its bigger, stronger, richer neighbor. What are you seeing? What have you heard?
There's a lot of concern, not only in the United States, in my home country of Canada as well, facing a cost of living crisis, and in European countries. But I think if I answer it this way, put the math very simple to people, is that since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the United States alone has earmarked about $38 billion a year to Ukraine, which comes out more or less as 4 or 5% of the U.S. defense annual budget. And with that money, the U.S., its allies and partners have been able to destroy about 50% of Russia's conventional military capability. Why is that important? That is important because many of us believe that if Mr. Putin is not stopped here in Ukraine, and it does look very, very dicey right now in terms of whether there can be a Ukrainian victory with not enough equipment here, but if he is not stopped here, he will go on. He will go on to the Baltic, probably Poland, Romania, countries which used to be part of the Soviet sphere. That will require NATO as a military entity to take action, and that would include U.S. troops. So at the end of the day, it will become much, much more costlier to push back Mr. Putin than just pushing him back here in Ukraine. A lot of the Ukrainians know that. They feel that deeply inside, and that's where they're fighting so hard. But I think, Ray, what they feel that a lot of outsiders don't see is the actual blood being spilled here on the ground. If I can put it to you in a short vignette very vividly, is a couple of weeks ago, I was in Lviv in Western Ukraine. That region has sent a lot of its sons, a lot of its men to the front line. I visited Lychakiv Cemetery, the military part of that cemetery, and it has grown by many, many times from the first time I visited from the beginning of the war. And, you know, it's so sad. It's so heartbreaking. You go there, you see kids just trying to make sense of it all, crying over their lost father, over a lost relative. You see wives there alone now. You see grandparents mourning. And I have spoken to a lot of people there, and they say there are actually little towns and villages around Lviv where there are no men anymore. They're at the front line, or they've died, or they're in rehabilitation. And these are towns and villages which still rely on basic manpower to survive. So again, it's this horrible tearing of the social fabric. It's this horrible loss of life. We don't know the official figures of the Ukrainian losses, but I think they're a lot bigger than have been published. That is really felt here in Ukraine.
This is real. This is where the reality of this war comes home. Places with no men. Large portions of the male population of the country in uniform, injured, or dead. For all that, for the way this society has been pinned down, is there a lot of awareness of what's going on in the wider world? When the Russians put the Estonian Prime Minister, Kaja Kallas, on a watch list, along with Baltic and Polish leaders, when Vladimir Putin gives an interview to Tucker Carlson in which he sort of holds forth on the history of Ukraine in a way that sort of erases Ukraine from the map of Europe. When the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives speculates on just cutting off the money, when a former U.S. president talks about signaling to Russia that it can basically have its way with NATO members. Is this heard in Lviv, in Kyiv, in places closer to the front line?
Yes, the Ukrainians are very, very big news consumers. They all have Telegram and other channels that come through. The Ukrainian media translates from English and other languages a lot into Ukrainian. So they see all of this. But I think, to answer your question, there's confusion as to why people in the West don't get this. I mean, I've traveled a lot since being here as well. I was in South Africa, for example, for that BRIC summit. I've been to the United States recently, to many European countries. And what I see is that the Russians have got such a big jumpstart on disinformation, on the spreading of fake news through channels like Russia Today, now commonly known as RT, that, you know, a lot of this has been amplified through different channels, that people are taking a lot of these lies, this disinformation, as fact. And the Ukrainians, with very little resources, are trying to counter this. I know NATO is, and the EU, but the Russians are way far ahead. I mean, they have the capability technologically and money-wise to tinker with past U.S. elections, and I wouldn't rule it out from them doing the same in the upcoming one. It's really even confusing to me, Ray, when I go to the United States and I talk to my educated friends there, and I hear things like President Volodymyr Zelensky is corrupt, and why should we be giving money to people like that? Well, I answer the same way I've just answered you, but I also say, look, it isn't as if all of this money is being placed onto pallets and put in a cargo aircraft and shipped to Kiev. A lot of it actually stays in the United States, and it goes to these military contractors who are producing the weaponry that is sent to Ukraine to help Mr. Putin be pushed back. But it does worry me also that if I'm in a taxi in Johannesburg, and the first item of news I hear is Mr. Putin again spewing off lies or disinformation, and it's not fact-checked, it's broadcast as fact. And I'm afraid that happens in a lot of what's commonly known as the global south, and the Russians are simply ramping up their efforts to spread false news. And one more thing, why is that important? Because a lot of these countries, of course, are members of the UN General Assembly, and we see a lot of them voting with Russia on crucial votes. So it's a lot of pieces of a complex puzzle. But again, Ukrainians know the Soviet mentality, the kind of track record, the playbook of Russia very, very well. And that's why they're so afraid of what could happen in the weeks and months ahead.
This is a part of the world you've been very deeply immersed in for a long time. We started talking about it a long time ago. When we mark the second anniversary of the invasion, will it almost rankle a little bit, Michael, because we should really be talking about the 10th anniversary of the invasion?
Absolutely. I came here in 2014 as part of the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe Special Monitoring Mission. I was their spokesperson. It's an important entity. It's the biggest regional security body in the world. We were the international eyes and ears on the ground here when the so-called little green men started to come into eastern Ukraine, when Crimea was illegally annexed, when 298 innocent souls were killed when a Russian Buk missile brought down Malaysian Airlines MH17, that Boeing 777. So yes, it goes back to then. And, you know, I was watching that Tucker Carlson interview the other day, or parts of it anyway. And when Putin was asked about, you know, these men in eastern Ukraine who took over the Donbass, and he basically said, well, we have nothing to do with them. Well, I have news for him. We saw with our own very eyes, we were there on the ground when these guys came in, the weaponry they had, the resources they had, some of them even with Russian army insignia. So there's no way that he can deny his role in those early stages. But this is the narrative that they're very, very good at putting across. You know, Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine, the second biggest city, is being bombed to smithereens day after day after day, including in the past 24 hours. It remains a Russian-speaking city. And if I remember correctly, Mr. Putin justified his, let's call it, second invasion of Ukraine, his full-scale invasion in February 2 years ago, to come here and protect Russian speakers or ethnic Russians. Well, why would you bomb to smithereens cities like Kharkiv, like Mariupol, like Kherson? It just doesn't make sense. But again, he's not often fact-checked on things like this, and that's why the narrative has spread as it has.
As badly as Russia has played its hand militarily since, as you refer to it, the full-scale invasion, has it done rather well in the sort of soft arts of modern warfare, of 21st century information war? It seems like every time there's a rising buzz in the West about a negotiated settlement, about Putin overtures, about Western doubts about Ukrainian ability to hold on, Putin gets it out into the ether that he's open to talking, and then kind of bizarrely gives another interview that leaves you with the distinct impression that his version of negotiation is very different from what they mean when they say the word in Berlin or Brussels or London, or even in the Republican caucus on Capitol Hill. Let's talk about the phantom of negotiations so far.
Well, if I can answer in a couple of ways there. Number one is that when it comes to going to capitals where negotiations are taking place. The Russians, number one, usually show up early. The Ukrainians show up the day before or the day of. Very few of them. They're outnumbered by the Russians. And they don't have the resources or the time to go around and do interviews with major media outlets, to write op-eds for certain newspapers to get their story across. So it's very, very difficult. And, I have to be honest with you. Part of the reason why Ukraine and this area, part of the world, is behind the information war game is at the beginning of the war, it appears to many of us that the Zelensky administration decided that it's going to be the main spokesperson for Ukraine. And it basically cut off the legs of the foreign ministry, reduced the budget of diplomatic posts. So they just don't have the resources to counter a lot of that in their respective capitals. The other thing that's happening right now, which is a mystery to all of us, is, for example, the ambassadorship of Ukraine to the United Kingdom has been vacant for a long, long time, and that's a key diplomatic post to be filled and to counter that Russian narrative. If we put the information warfare aside for a moment, the other thing that Russia is doing, I believe, is fighting like a real coward. And what do I mean by that? There's a couple of things. Number one, they're treating the front line with a kind of meat grinder approach, sending as many men as possible, many of them recruited from very remote areas of Russia. You have former convicts in there, and putting wave after wave after wave towards the Ukrainians. So they're outnumbered, perhaps even as high as 8-1, and their losses are huge. So the other cowardly thing they're doing right now is what I referred to earlier, sending drones and missiles this way. And it's very, very difficult for Ukraine to defend itself, even with the amount of Western weaponry it's received. Yes, they do a good job in terms of bringing these drones and missiles down. But you have days, we had one a few days ago in this part of Ukraine where only 11 of 17 were brought down. And then closer to this last New Year's, only about 50% of incoming was shot down. So it's basically a David and Goliath fight on not only the front line in the air, but also on the informational battlefront.
When Vladimir Putin talks about negotiation, does he really mean at the end of those negotiations that there would be no sovereign and intact Ukraine?
Yes, that I think is the end goal, is for Mr. Putin to achieve his dream of Ukraine becoming either part of the former Soviet Union or disappearing altogether after he continues to put forth these lies that, Ukraine is full of Nazis, full of criminals, that it's very, very corrupt. But I have to underline one thing, and this goes back not only to 2014 when I came here as part of the OSCE, but also in recent times where even if Mr. Putin puts his signature on an agreement, how are we to believe it? So many of these so-called agreements, ceasefire agreements, humanitarian pauses, whatever you want to call them, have been violated by the Soviet side, that he's not to believe. And I think that even if, for example, you got a big regional power like Turkey involved as a guarantor, it still wouldn't make a difference. So it's a very difficult phase right now because, yes, everyone wants this war to end. Everyone wants peace, but on whose terms? The Ukrainians have made it clear, Mr. Zelensky, that not 1 inch of Ukrainian territory that's been occupied, that's been seized, will be given up, because he says that most Ukrainians, or 90% or whatever, don't want that. And I'm of the opinion that Mr. Putin is not in the mood to give up any territory, especially Crimea, and especially that land bridge that connects the Russian mainland to Crimea. We're at a very, very difficult phase right now. I think it'll take, at the end of the day, Ray, a lot of crafty diplomacy, a lot of Western leaders growing the spine to stand up to Mr. Putin and say enough is enough, and not falling for his bluffs of, for example, using nuclear tactical weapons, or not succumbing to the fear that Russia imploding if things get bad enough there is a bad thing.
But as I listen to you talking about how difficult victory on the battlefield would be, not really sure that if there was some sort of breakthrough, that you could trust the Russians to keep their end of the deal. Well, it sounds a little hopeless.
Well, what I hear from Ukrainian diplomats and from ordinary Ukrainians, they're very, very patient people and they're strong people. So they're willing to fight for a long time. I did mention about the amount of deaths and injuries and, the tearing of the social fabric previously, but a lot of them feel that there will come a day of reckoning that Mr. Putin, whether pass through natural means or he'll be assassinated or things will change in other ways. What I would argue personally, and I've been arguing the same thing from day one of this full-scale invasion, is that the noose has to be tightened much, much more severely around those in Mr. Putin's elite circle. I think, Ray, we have to get to that point, and it's going to be very difficult because you have to get the Turkeys of the world into this, you have to get the Gulf states. But when you come to the point where the only place the Russian elite can go vacation is in North Korea or those fake resort islands that the Chinese are building in the South China Sea, well, that's the point where the rubber hits the road. And I think there would be a lot of pressure on Mr. Putin to change course.
I wonder, though, if absent the aid, whether Ukraine can really keep up the fight. There are vibrations coming out of the country that there will be a great deal of unhappiness if there's another conscription call that goes out, that the well is almost dry. And maybe Vladimir Putin was smart when he thought, because I'm not a Democrat running a democracy, I can handle endless casualties, and I can just keep grinding away here because I know eventually my opponents will cave.
Let me answer about the immediate neighborhood. So, yes, he has his friends and allies. He has them including in Moldova, which is also threatened a lot by Russia. And I think the Putin playbook is to wait it all out, and especially to see Mr. Trump get back into the White House. And the thing everyone has to remember here, well, there are a couple of things. Number one is that dictators watch each other very carefully. And you have Xi Jinping in Beijing watching very carefully what's going on here in this part of the world, how much assistance, for example, the United States is giving to Ukraine. Will the 60 billion or so be approved and get to Kyiv? Should this aid not come, it will be, in my mind, a green light for him to proceed, which will be very, very bad, and which will draw the U.S. into very difficult conflict as well as his allies. A good friend and colleague of mine from another network who has spent a lot of time in Ukraine has painted a worst-case scenario. He said if that 60 billion or so does not arrive, Russia could probably fully occupy Ukraine within 2 years. That's a very, very scary scenario to contemplate.
Well, we have front-loaded the bad news for our listeners and painted, I think, a legitimately dire picture. But Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, not only in Washington, but in other European capitals, has been ringing the alarm bells, talking not only about a continuing support for Ukraine, but for a ramping up of the European defense industry and Europe's ability to defend itself. You're intimately familiar with the OSCE and its deliberations. Is Europe on notice in a way that it wasn't?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are little things and big things that move the needle in that direction. One of them is we've had a few incidents now where Russian missiles have transited through NATO airspace, not only through Moldova, but also through Poland. And you've had fragments land there as well. And I think that was a kind of wake-up signal, not only to Poland, but to all of NATO, that the war is getting closer to them. And I think there's also a growing realization, kind of zooming out here a bit, that events in one part of the world can affect within days one's economy. I mean, in a way, it's sad that people have to be woken up to the fact that this war is going on. There's another one going on in the Middle East, and that you're going to feel it through your pocketbook. Well, if that's what it takes, let it be. But I think here in Ukraine, after it didn't go so well for Mr. Zelensky in Washington, one of the first trips he took were to the Baltic states. And I think that was showing us that at the end of the day, he's going to rely more on his immediate neighbors, the Baltic states, Poland, and European countries, because this war feels much, much more closer to them. Let me insert, if I can, Ray, a positive note here. I feel I've almost been a little bit too negative, but we also have to remember that Ukraine is basically a nation with no navy. And a lot of the resources that have come this way have gone to land forces or air. But with very minimal maritime resources, they've been able to bust this terrifying Russian blockade of the Black Sea. So this shows that with even a bit of help, the Ukrainians can make it a lot easier for people around the world to continue to live normal lives.
Somehow, you're leaving us on a positive note. It's almost hard to believe, given the tone of the conversation. Michael Boserkiw, great to talk to you.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Sienna Barnes. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.